O children of Zion, be glad and rejoice in the Lord your God. For he has given the early rain for your vindication. He has poured down for you abundant rain, the early and the later rain as before. This is a proclamation of blessings to come. Blessings on the people, blessings on the land, blessings eventually. The threshing floors shall be full of grain, the vats shall overflow with wine and oil. According to the book of Joel, God in time will show favor upon those who have suffered, those who have been doing without. I will repay you for the years that the swarming locust has eaten, the hopper, the destroyer, and the cutter, my great army which I sent against you. Disasters in the Bible are often linked to the immoral behavior of the people or the leaders of the people. The initial part of Joel informs the people that the locusts are like an invading army sent by God. The sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes. Then everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. The people are then to repent their sinful ways. They are to ask for God's forgiveness, for this is a promise of future blessings. You shall eat in plenty and be satisfied and praise the name of the Lord your God, who has dealt wondrously with you, and my people shall never again be put to shame. There's a lot being promised here. Eat plenty and be satisfied, for God has dealt wondrously, both in the lead up to the calamity and in the delivery of these blessings. For wonders are not always entirely good. And the people will never be ashamed again, never again ashamed of their sinfulness, because they will not sin anymore. Of course, that depends upon whether the sinning comes to an end. As I continue my sermon series about the days that changed the world, I turn to a day that all Americans would recognize, I hope, July 4th, 1776. That was the day upon which the Declaration of Independence was ratified by the Second Continental Congress, which was meeting in Philadelphia. This document included a list of grievances of the colonies from the acts or the omissions of the British Empire. It was not a declaration of war, for the Americans had been fighting against the British for more than a year at that point. But what were they fighting about? The Stamp Act, the Townshend Act, and the other so-called coercive or intolerable acts. Excuse me. And one of those acts was actually the Quebec Act, which allowed freedom of religion for Catholics up in the colony of Quebec. This was intolerable because it sought to weaken the preeminence of Protestantism in the colonies. Intolerable is indeed a relative word. This list of grievances was a way of explaining the war and the revolution it represented. A revolution can be defined as a desire to sweep away the past and replace it with something else. Traditions are set aside, long-standing ideas are thrown out, and what is left is something entirely new. Was the American Revolution then really a revolution using that definition? Perhaps. It was a revolutionary step that allowed colonies to go on their own, to have the formerly governed take over, to have the oppressed cast off their oppressors. To think that any of that was possible was certainly revolutionary in the 18th century. Of course, looking back through history, conquered lands had freed themselves before from foreign occupation. Many European countries owed their own existence to being former Roman provinces. But in the 18th century, land was gained or lost through imperial struggle, one against the other. It was not until the American colonies decided to break away and to adopt a republican form of government that the seeds of revolution against kings and against oppressors, that was truly the moment it was sown in the modern mind. And given that the war had already started, what was the purpose of setting out any declaration that many months afterwards? The opening sentence of the Declaration explains the need. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them to another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitled them, A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. The colonists were explaining their actions in one sense, and they were also setting forth their arguments to be considered by the folks back home in England. For there were many who sympathized with the colony's desire for either political representation within the empire or political independence from it. There were others, however, who considered this idea to be ridiculous. Under the system of English law, Parliament was the ultimate power. At that time, there was no equivalent to an English constitution, in part because the Parliament was thought to be the embodiment of all law, and therefore all that Parliament decided was permissible by nature. This meant that everything was subject to the laws of Parliament, absolutely everything. And some of the American colonists did not agree with such an unbridled form of power. The next sentence of the Declaration spells out what is perhaps the most well-known and influential message in the document. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Just so you know, it is unalienable according to the National Archives, though inalienable has become the proper usage. There's a lot in that sentence. All men are created equal. They have the right have this right given to them by their Creator, and therefore those rights are unalienable. And among those rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And those three declarations are a formulation of rights. Where did they come from? Who thought them up? The English philosopher John Locke is called the father of liberalism, though the word liberal here is not the same liberal that is used in modern conversations. To be a liberal now has certain political associations that did not exist in centuries past. One idea for Locke in his liberalism was the notion of rights, natural rights that exist independently of the law. For example, he would not agree that Parliament had the right to infringe upon such rights. In this sense, they are unalienable, meaning they cannot be bought or sold, they cannot be placed under the authority of others. And he noted three rights as being fundamental to the human condition, and these were life, liberty, and property. Obviously, something has changed on this list. The right to life is just that, the right to be able to live. Kings and princes have no right to infringe upon one's life. That means no right to kill someone, but also no right to harm them in mind or body. No capital punishment, no flogging, no cruel and unusual punishments. That one makes it into the Constitution years later. The right to liberty covers a few subjects. The right to be free from government restraint, like imprisonment. No restrictions on where you can move and what you can do. No restrictions on your livelihood. No restrictions such as being a serf, someone that's tied to the land and is also controlled by the lord and the manor. In many ways, this right was an argument against medieval government and social control. The right to property becomes the cornerstone of modern economics. You own your possessions, and no one has a right to take them away from you without just compensation. But it also covers the ownership of your labor, your reputation, your money. Money was an intellectual concept. It wasn't an actual possession. Modern life in the United States would be unrecognizable without these three rights. And that is one reason why the Declaration had such a widespread intellectual effect, creating a new basis for defining communities and nations based on individual rights. But the Declaration did not say life, liberty, and property. Where does property go, and where does happiness enter the picture? Well, Thomas Jefferson wrote the bulk of the Declaration, the first draft, and he made the change. And this change of language should not be interpreted as Jefferson being somehow against private property. The change to the pursuit of happiness was a philosophical shift in language, one that was pretty subtle in the 18th century and one that has lost most of its intended meaning centuries later. Jefferson was a crucial figure in the foundation of American thought. But these ideas were, in some cases, many cases, borrowed from others. Clearly, he borrowed from John Locke, but he also borrowed heavily from ancient Greece. And he was unusual in that sense because other founding fathers were more Roman in their intellectual DNA. People like Washington and Adams, who were more comfortable with a hierarchical society, with some people being just more suited to being in charge, a more aristocratic America. Jefferson was a classical small d Democrat, believing that government was by and through the consent of the governed. He was more comfortable with the concept of revolution because he was not interested in the traditions of the past, like the Romans. The Romans were, frankly, obsessed with building upon ancient traditions. The Greeks, particularly from Athens, however, they looked to a better future, a future that was built upon the possibilities that they could think up and then try to bring into the world. Jefferson was an avowed Epicurean, and that doesn't mean he liked, good food and drink and merriment. For that, you're better off looking at Benjamin Franklin, honestly. No, Jefferson was a philosophical Epicurean, and the primary goal of that philosophical outlook is happiness. Happiness in this sense is not our everyday definition. Happiness means to be free from pain of the body and confusion of the mind. That's one definition. Happiness is also intended to provide the greatest good for the greatest number of people. This is the sort of happiness talked about by Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, and other utilitarians. When Jefferson added the pursuit of happiness to that initial list of rights in the Declaration, he was introducing something beyond the individual rights thought up by John Locke. Jefferson went beyond saying that this is my life, this is my liberty, and this is my stuff. Happiness introduces a sense of personal connection to something beyond one particular and personal set of concerns. Again, this sort of happiness is not feeding one's appetites. Jefferson would describe it in his personal journal. Happiness, the aim of life. Virtue, the foundation of happiness. Utility, the test of virtue. Virtue consists of prudence, temperance, fortitude, and justice. Happiness is the goal for living, and it arises from a sense of virtue. Prudence, being careful. Temperance, being balanced. Fortitude, being brave. Justice, being fair. If life and liberty are unalienable, then the rights of others to life and liberty are also unalienable, meaning that our lives and our liberties need to be cognizant of the rights of others. My life cannot be lived at the expense of others. My liberties cannot be expressed so as to prevent others from being free. Happiness in this sense is not about fulfilling one personal set of rights, but achieving a careful and fair balancing of rights. And we also have to be brave enough to protect our rights while also protecting those of others. Jefferson was noted for his ideas of a social contract, a way that we have to just agree to live together to protect and to respect these various rights. And it's important to notice that he did not declare a right to happiness. It is the right to pursue happiness. Happiness as a goal, happiness as an ongoing balancing act, happiness as that agreement, that contract, that covenant among people. These ideas for rights, they didn't come out of thin air. They were, in many cases, derived from the Bible as well as from Greek philosophy. We sometimes think of the Bible as being something other than philosophy. The Bible is something other than ideas being set down by ancient people trying to live their lives in better ways, if not in perfect harmony. For example, John Locke looked at the idea of imago Dei, the idea that we are made in the image of God. And if any one of us is in the image of God, then we all are in the image of God. And if we all are, then we are endowed with the same and sacred rights. The right to pursue happiness is much the same. For the Ten Commandments as a covenant of practices for how people in Israel were to live their lives together in concert with one another, in concert with the expectations of God. That is one way of being in covenant. What happens when you fail to live up to that covenant? Well, according to our reading, locusts. Now, I don't believe that you should expect divine punishment coming anytime soon. And I also don't believe that we are in the midst of some kind of divine punishment with the ebbs and flows of the pandemic. The true punishments for failing to live according to the conditions of our covenants with one another, what are they? They are uncertainty, they are anxiety, distrust, discontent, suspicion. When we no longer have confidence that everyone is living up to the virtues set down as the fundamental ideals of a country. And the unalienable nature of our rights doesn't mean that people have not found ways to abuse them. If the Ten Commandments can be broken, so can these rights. The government might be the problem. Some person in our life might be the problem. Some group in society might be the problem. The right to life, does not make us immortal. The right to liberty does not mean that liberty cannot be infringed upon or even lost. The right to pursue happiness doesn't mean that we are somehow able to take a breath, let alone take a break from our burdens. The right to pursue happiness doesn't make us happy. Recall that Jefferson wrote all those lovely words about unalienable rights, and yet he was a slave owner. He declared that we have the right to life, yet he bought and sold lives. He declared that we have the right to liberty, yet he shackled human beings with chains of iron and chains of law. He declared that we have a right to pursue happiness, a philosophical ideal built on the foundation of high-minded virtues. And yet, during his lifetime, Jefferson utterly controlled the lives, liberties, and happiness of 600 people, 600 enslaved Africans. And it is worth noting that these rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are not actual rights enjoyed by Americans. If you grabbed a copy of the Declaration of Independence and went into court and asked a judge to enforce these rights, the judge would stare at you. As a matter of law, the Declaration of Independence has become no more significant than the philosophy of John Locke. It is intellectually interesting, but it is not legally persuasive. The strength of these rights arises from the imagination of Americans and those around the world who have sought to emulate these ideals. When we talk about the American dream, these rights are at the foundation, and any loss or diminishment of that dream stems from a lack of respect for that foundation by us and by our society. When we make choices in the coming weeks about how we are to be governed, how we are to vote, we should take a moment, stop and think, what would be the better next step? Not the perfect step, not the best step, but the one better next step that we can take right now. If happiness is about avoiding pain and confusion, it is also about reducing the pain and confusion floating around in our country. Not just my pain and confusion, not just your pain and confusion, and not because of some bleeding heart sentiment. We do this to support a system of government that protects life, liberty, and the happiness potential of us all. A system that protects my rights should also protect all rights. The Declaration of Independence was a declaration of freedom from an intolerable set of laws and from a government that did not provide any representation. Our system of laws here in the United States, they're not perfect. Our system of government could use a little work. And one positive step in the process of repair is to reconsider those high-minded values, those better ways of living and governing, and those ancient virtues of the Bible and classical philosophy, some of which are in the Declaration. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness need to be protected, and they need to be returned to a sense of balance. We have a decent thing going here in America, for all of its faults, and we have some good ideas set down on paper that seem to have survived for 2 centuries. Again, not always perfect in the moment, but pretty effective over time with the right and good intentions behind them. Now we just need to stop arguing over every single question that faces our nation and every single opinion that just pops to mind. And instead, we need to focus on common values and the common good for a change. Amen.